few minutes. Okay. Welcome everyone to the third City Island Nautical Museum Winter Web Series webinar. Tonight we have a very special presentation, a short history of City Island presented by the museum's president and curator, longtime City Island resident and historian, and my dad, Tom Nye. I'm very excited to be here tonight with you all. We've had really great success with the last two, and this one I'm sure will be really successful as well. A few notes about tonight. My dad, Tom, will come on. He's going to give a PowerPoint, and then we reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. And because the video and audio have been turned off for this event, we hope that you'll still engage with each other either in the chat box or in the question and answer, sort of commenting and letting us know what things you want to hear covered. The event is being recorded and we hope to share it, on YouTube as we have with the other ones. So check out our YouTube page if you missed either the webinar on Hard Island or on City Island's artists. They both had really great content. So tonight though, is a short history of City Island. And my dad knows it all, as I know from, being in the same house growing up with him. He has books and books on the history of City Island. He knows everything about the yacht yards. He knows everything about the museum. He's been with it since it restarted in the 90s. He's been an active member of the Trinity United Methodist Church. He loves City Island. So I am very excited to welcome him tonight and to have you all here and to share this webinar with you all. Let's see. All right.
Hi and welcome. And first off, I'd like to say that because we're only talking about 45 minutes to an hour, we can't get everything in, but we'll cover everything and we'll try to answer questions after it. We have a ton of pictures and too many to put on for this presentation. But again, we're also adding albums all the time to the City Island Nautical Museum Facebook page. And there'll be, in the future, a timeline history of the island, which will have all the dates and more descriptions of the different times in the history of City Island. But I guess without further ado, let's just proceed with what we have. Here we have a chart of City Island in 1851 and a map 1867, roughly about 100 years from when Benjamin Palmer had the idea of developing the island into a seaport that would rival that of New York. What seemed like or seems like a kind of crazy idea now because of how developed New York Harbor is, with all the yacht yard or shipyards rather that were in Brooklyn and the ports. It wasn't such a crazy idea back in 1761 when the country was before the country was actually a country, and New York was still very young in its development. The area around City Island has plenty of deep water and protected area. And City Island and Sandy Hook have long been known as the entrances to New York from either Long Island Sound or the Atlantic Ocean. So Benjamin Palmer's idea wasn't so far-fetched. And in the description, in the map, I'm sorry, if you can go back there just for a second. The map on the right, you can see that in 1867, it was starting to be developed, of which it took over 100 years of planning. Instead, it happened more as a natural progression. And the oyster industry and the pilot industry were the initial factors that led to the development of City Island. Okay. These were all taken in recent years, but they are among the attractions that brought people here in the first place. The island was and is an island off Westchester and the Bronx, and it was always noted that it was a beautiful area. Early on, the original inhabitants were the Seminole and Lenape Indians, who were part of the Mohegan and Algonquin tribes in the east, and they would farm, fish, and hunt, the land that was fertile and rich with wildlife, so that they basically had plenty to eat, and they also used it for clothes and also for tools. Again, the island offshore in recent years, and ironically, the two boats in that photo were built by an islander in recent years also. And here's day-to-day life on City Island now. You have a Wednesday night up in the left-hand corner off the City Island Yacht Club for the EBYRA. Now it's the Big Tom series off the island, which involved by all the clubs, including those on the North Shore of Long Island, from Port Washington to Great Neck. And you can see that the attractions that people had early on still remain. With all the changes on City Island, this remains the same. Back in 1639, after Jonas Bronk had sailed by or bought land, which became the Western Bronx, on the east side, Anne Hutchison had come down from Connecticut, or from New England rather. She was one of your early women activists, religious woman, but it came to be that some of her beliefs were found to be too radical for the Puritans up there, and they brought her on trial and they wanted to banish her from the area. She decided to move south and out of the area where she could have more freedoms. And she settled in an area which would be very close to where Split Rock is now. And if any of you don't know where Split Rock is, it's on that triangle as you exit off the Hutch to get onto 95 and drive up to the top. It's covered by some trees now, but it's still there. And the actual location of her homestead was there, and others believe it was on the other side of the Hutch where the bus depot is, but it was up in that area. In any case, she settled there and made peace with the Indians in 1642. However, within a year, and because relationships with the Indians had soured with the Dutch, her whole homestead, she and 18 of her family members were massacred. About 6 of them got away, including her daughter, who was captured by the Indians, and she was raised by the Indians. Everyone else was killed, but in fact, her daughter, I believe her name was Susanna, became an Indian and actually was married to Wampage, the head of the chief of the Indians at the time. And at a time when she could have gone back and lived a free life, she decided to stay because she had no recollection of her earlier years. She was very young when she was captured. That's in the early 1640s, at which time, after a few years, they became peaceful again with the Indians. And Thomas Pell, on your left here, came down from Fairfield County in Connecticut, and he bought land from the Indians, including all of east of the Bronx, or what would become the Bronx, and Lower Westchester on the Sound in 1654. And while Jonas Bronk had the western half. And he had a little bit of trouble with the Dutch, but before long, the English let it be known that they were here to stay. And he was able to live in peace with the Dutch for as long as they stayed in New York or New Amsterdam at the time. Thomas Pell died in 1669, at which time he gave all the land to his son, or his nephew rather, John Pell, his brother's son, because he had no kids. And John Pell, in fact, had all the land, including what was known as Minifers or Mulberry or Minowitz Island, which later became City Island. Now, John Pell was still over in England, but he came over to America at that time to become the second Lord of the Manor. John Pell, at different times, had sold different parcels of the land, including City Island. He had it with Gabriel Munville, where he had the City Island as holding title for a claim that Gabriel Munville had on a debt that John Pell had to him. This lasted until the early 1700s, when John Pell's son, another Thomas Pell, took over the land and actually repaid all the dues and the debt. So it became his land and problem again. And then during the 1740s, the area became bought and sold by a number of people, including yet another Thomas Pell, who bought certain areas on the island, which his descendants stayed on until the late 1800s. But by 1750, it fell into several different owners, including Samuel Rodman. And then in 1761, Joseph Palmer, who was a businessman and one of the first justices of Westchester County, bought it. And sometimes these people would buy it sight unseen, simply because in those days, land, which was pretty abundant at the time, and it was used to settle claims or debts and transactions. And Justice Palmer kept it for about a month. I think he bought it in May of 1761. And within a month and a half's time, he sold it to his brother, Benjamin Palmer, who lived in what was called Throg's Neck, after a Throgmorton, who was another earlier settler. And he bought it, and he had great plans to develop City Island and the surrounding area as a port that would rival that of New York Harbor. Now, you can see in the map on the left, Palmer had the island surveyed and mapped out into 30 by 100 foot plots. And I'm not sure if that equates to the sizes on the map, but he did have it mapped out with property owners then. I'm sure that those parcels are much longer or bigger than 30 by 100. But in any case, they were all dedicated to homes, residences, businesses, shipyards, different shops in a town, what would make up a town, schools, and as well as religious houses of worship. But along with this, Benjamin Palmer changed the name of City Island to that, or from Minifers Island to City Island, feeling that it would be more fitting for his ideas of developing the island. Here we have a map of, or a view of Long Island, Connecticut, and New York, showing Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. So you could see with Palmer's plan, ships coming in from the east would travel down Long Island Sound, which would be as terrible as conditions can be in the Sound. They'd be better than they would be in the ocean. So you would cut off over 100 miles of unpredictable ocean weather and conditions, as well as still being close to New York, Connecticut, and Long Island, and the different harbors there. Palmer's plan was cut short by the American Revolution, and as well, a lot of the financial conditions of some of the early investors and owners in property here were also. But there were several people on the island still, and they did barter with traveling. And they said at the time that the British held the island by day and the islanders or the Americans held it by night.
Yes, excuse me.
In October of 1776, you had the Battle of Pell's Point, which was probably the biggest national event that take place around here. And Glover's Rock is a monument to said right on the Shore Road. There have been a number of different stories of where the battle took place, but it's generally accepted that the British landed just south of the Pelham Bay Bridge and marched forward along Split Rock Road. And if you're not familiar with Split Rock Road is, it's in the northwest corner of the parking lot where the golf course is now, and it heads up towards Pelham and Mount Vernon. Along the road, there are a series of rock walls of which the Americans would retreat behind and hold back Howe's forces, several thousand in all of his troops, British and Hessian troops. And he allowed Washington to retreat from northern Manhattan to White Plains. In this picture, which I think is on the a mural in the Bronx courthouse, it shows pretty much how it might have looked back then. You had a lot of troops, and they didn't really have a uniform then, although some of them have the blue uniform, which were made up by a lot of the women in the colonies for the rebels, if you want to call them that. But as it turns out, General Howe's troops, and a lot of them had come over in the ships that occupied Eastchester Bay, and we'll show in another slide how many ships. This is how Eastchester Bay looked at one time. Ironically, or coincidentally, the Howe brothers, General Howe was in charge of the troops on land, and Admiral Howe was in charge of the British Navy in the colonies. And on any given day, you could have as many as 70 ships like this in Eastchester Bay. Now, after the American Revolution, many of the investors had lost all their money, and they just gave up on their plans on City Island, while others stayed on, and they dealt mostly with the ships that would travel up and down the Sound, that would wait for tides and or a better time to go down to New York Harbor off City Island. And as such, they would stop there and make any quick repairs, and also deal with the inhabitants on the island for any food that they might have. But from 1793, when the Tontine Coffee House was established down off Wall Street, and it was kind of like an early stock exchange, but it was where also a lot of businessmen would meet and discuss business, make transactions, and buy and sell things. And City Island and parts thereof were bought and sold here a number of times for the next 30 years, from 1890 to the, or 1790 to the 1820s. This is just a map to show City Island in the late 1890s. I have to say that some of the slides are in not so much in chronological order, and because the PowerPoint doesn't translate the same when you switch from one computer to another. But this is, you can see how it's grown. Now, this is 1926 and one of the earliest aerial views of the island. But it may be how Benjamin Palmer envisioned the island in 1761, with the piers jutting out and some of the big three-masted schooners off City Island that would be there and come at anchor. If they were traveling from Canada or out of the country, they would come here and wait for a quarantine doctor to give them the okay to proceed. And as well, they would pick up a pilot to take them down through the East River and Hellgate. But if you go back to that picture just for a moment, I will say something about that. In 1761, one of the biggest things that Benjamin Palmer did was he petitioned to King George about allowing the shorefront owners to own or get the riparian rights for 400 feet out from the high tide mark, which would allow them to have the docks and shore up their low-lying bulkheads and so forth, so that they could establish the shipyards. Now, this was 1926, and there were a lot of shipyards then, and you could see that they hadn't really abused that privilege at that point. If you take a look down at Belden Point, you have, and it's high tide here, you still have a nice beach around the whole perimeter of the island. In the lower center part, you can see that it's really undeveloped, and that was the Rodman Park, which would be between Pilot Street and Center Street. And on the east side is where Miniford would be, that area that's undeveloped. That would be between the Nevins Yard and the Robert Jacob Yard. In the top right corner, you can see Pelham Bay, and over on the mid-right or mid-left, you can see where Turtle Cove, the Metropolitan Yacht Club is, and right between Rodman Neck and City Island, just south of the bridge, is where the Morris Yacht Club was at this time in 1926. But Tent City is still there also. Now, this is the Horton homesteads, several of the Horton homes early on. George W. Horton was one of the earliest settlers, buying the southern half of the island from Nicholas Haight in 1819. He bought from basically Pilot Street to Belden Point. Their homestead was on Belden Street, Belden Place, Belden Road at the time. And you can see that in the upper left. After George W. Horton passed away, and it was no longer used as the Horton Homestead, it became a restaurant, then a beer garden, and it's now still part of the Lobster Box restaurant. They turned it 90 degrees so that the front of it would face City Island Avenue. But if you go down, or you can see in another picture that we'll have, the roof of this building, which is still intact, is still there. This is on the, if you go back to that one, On the right is the Horton, Benjamin Horton, established the Horton Telegraph and weather station, which would be on Marine Street corner. And that is where a lot of the ships that came in would receive their further orders from whoever they were working for and that. And they could also pick up provisions. And they had a big potbelly stove in the middle of it with benches all around. And many of the old captains, shipyard workers, oystermen, and pilots would sit around on these benches and spin yarns, as they said. In the lower left-hand corner is another Horton homestead that was on Rochelle Street and torn down in, I guess, the late 60s or mid 70s, by the mid 70s. And on the two fellas there, on the left is George W. Horton, and then his son, Stephen Decatur Horton. They were in shipping, but they were also instrumental in pilots. And on the right, lower right, is Vera Horton rowing what we would call a pilot skiff. These were very popular at the time, and they were built by all the yards, BF Wood being the most well-known of building them. This is the Daniel Schofield house, which later became a Fordham family house. I think these are the Fordhams in the photo in the early 1900s. But this house was located on Bay Street, just west of William Avenue. And during the 50s, 60s, and 70s was, or early 60s was finally torn down. But it was the haunted house on City Island, if you grew up during that time. It was all overgrown. What you can see on the side of it, on the left side, if the photo was, the contrast was better, you could see the bridge in the background, and because there were no other homes around. But this is a house that's on the maps, and it probably goes back to the early 1800s when Daniel Schofield first came to the island. Now here's just south of Hawkins Street looking north, and all the buildings that you see here, or at least most of them, are still standing. The building right to the immediate left with the sign James Bell up on top is where Louis the Barber is. And on the corner, you can see the building where the Black Whale is. And that, I've heard stories that it was taken over from Hart Island, but I've seen no evidence or concrete information that would confirm that. On the right-hand side, you see the building that would be where the bars were, and then where Exotica is now, which is most commonly known as the cigar store building. This was early on, and as Ed Sadler had mentioned, they added a story, but what they did was they jacked this building up and they built another story underneath it. So it's the same building that you see right now on the corner, the northeast corner of Hawkins Street and City Island Avenue, which would have been Orchard Street at the time. And then to the immediate right is Sam Miller's general store, which was on the 278 City Island Avenue, which is still there. What they did is, you can see it has the pitched roof here, but they just changed the whole facade of the front of the building, and they added it on to the building just to the south of it, so it looks like one long building. But that is a separate building right there. This would be sometime in the early 1900s, before 1910. Now this one is Main Street, City Island. Yep, go back. This is Main Street, City Island, and it's always been identified as looking south from Ditmar Street. But even though I know that many of the homes have changed and even the ones that are still standing have been altered somewhat, I can't align myself, and looking all the way down the avenue, it looks like a tree is, at a dead end there. So I can't confirm that this is, but everyone since I was a little kid has always said that this is looking south from Ditmar Street. Now, this gives a better indication of, you can see where they turned the Horton House on City Island Avenue at Belden Place and turned it to the face of the avenue. At one time, it was Durier's restaurant, another old family, and there's still a Durier on City Island. And then if you look at the picture of the lobster box, you can see the roof of the building still there, the chimneys, and it's more evident inside also. Some of the old fixtures still from the building. They just built around it. Here's another old building. This again from a Schofield estate on the right. It's the police station here, but originally it was a City Island school built in 1865 on the northwest corner of Orchard Street and City Island Avenue. And when they built the Hawkins Street Park in the early 1930s, this had been raised and they dismantled. However, they took a good portion of the building and moved it a couple of blocks. I don't know how they did it, but they did an awful lot of moving houses back in those days. And this house on the left on Center Street is what is still left of that building. And you can see how the windows and the corners match up, but they rebuilt it. But that was done quite a bit. They would move houses up a block or around a corner. And there are a number of buildings that on City Island that is still like that. On the left here is the first schoolhouse built in 1839, where the playground is now for PS 175. And then the second schoolhouse that we just looked at, which later became the police station for about 20 years. It was the schoolhouse on the right from 1865 when Schofield donated the property and until 1898 when the new school was built on 190 Fordham Street. However, on the left side or the right side of the building, if you were in it, you can see that there's an outside stairway that they added on to the building. It was later taken off because they needed better egress for the students who they felt if they were in the school and there was a fire, they would be trapped. So that was a precaution that they took. And remember, this is all part of the town of Pelham that City Island was part of. And it was the greater part of Pelham, in fact. And then here you go back to the original site, PS 175, built where the Nevins Yard. The Nevins Yard replaced where the first school was, and then PS 175 replaced where Nevins was. In the fall of 1974, they took down the Nevins building that was in fact dormant for the previous 12 years from say 1962. And it was the end of an era at City Island because while it was still standing and while it was dormant, it was a reminder of the glory days at City Island when City Island was a major yacht building center. And there's the school at 190 Fordham Street, which is also home to the City Island Nautical Museum, the community center, and a number of condos. Not to be forgotten, St. Mary's Star of the Sea had an elementary school as early as the 1930s, but by 1949, they were able to have the elementary school built. Unfortunately, in recent years, it closed due to budget costs within the Catholic diocese. We've got a number of houses of worship that all work together on City Island. The Episcopal Church on Pilot Street, the Methodist Church on Bay Street and City Island Avenue, St. Mary's on City Island Avenue, and Temple Bethel also on City Island. Well, they're all on City Island Avenue. But they've all worked with each other on one occasion or another. In fact, before Temple Bethel was built in the 50s, many of the congregation met in Fellowship Hall at the Trinity Methodist Church and as well as different homes of certain people. And I believe at the Rosenfeld's home on occasion too. Here's another house that's still standing. William Schofield, Daniel's brother, one of the early settlers. While Hortons were involved in shipping and the Fordhams were involved in shipbuilding and the oyster industry, Schofields dealt mostly in farming on the island, and they had several orchards. On Schofield Street, very close to William Avenue, was an old house, and in our generation, it was the home of the Brunos, Frank Bruno being the designer at Ratsey and Lapthorne. Mary, his sister, was also a sailmaker, and Bobby Bruno was a young, one of the kids on City Island that we all grew up with. But in recent years, we've had, I'm not sure of the new owner's name, but they rebuilt the house, and they did a beautiful job and in keeping something very much alive on City Island that they really had no attachment to before. The Hortons, here's an evolution of another house. Stephen Decatur Horton had the house built, which became the Morris Yacht Club. And that had to be as early as the 1820s or 30s. And you could see it in different stages. When it was the Monte Carlo Hotel and Restaurant, it was a French restaurant by the late teens. It was a Camp Bartholomew at one point. And it finally became the Morris Yacht Beach Club in 1937 when Robert Moses kicked everyone off of Rodman Neck for the development of Pelham Bay Park and Orchard Beach. But it was a landmark at City Island and a beautiful building. Now this picture isn't too much for the artistic value as much as the historical value. This is a painting that Jenny Lowndes gave to the museum or was left to the museum after her death. Jenny Lowndes was an old-time City Islander, very active in the Methodist Church. And this is on the beach just north of Tier Street, where the shoreline faces north and diagonally across from the Harlem Yacht Club. But this was known as the Cove to the local oystermen. And what you see in the picture are a lot of oyster sloops at their moorings, some skiffs, and oyster barges, where when the oystermen came in from their daily haul, they would store their oysters in the water in the holes in these barges prior to them being taken down to the markets down at Fulton Street by the market sloops or schooners. But you can see there's a couple on the beach there that will hold that for service. Here's some other pictures of the oyster boats that were around City Island at the time. In the top left is Fred Glazier, a long line of glaciers that were on the island, and with a typical oyster skiff. These were really very popular at the time, and they ranged anywhere from 16 to 24 feet. You might find some that were a little bit smaller and maybe even a little bit bigger, but they could hold a good amount of oysters. These were the lines of the oyster skiff. Also, they were known as the oyster skiff, Staten Island skiff, or a Yankee skiff. Two examples of oyster boats that were built at City Island. The Moccasin was actually built for the 40-foot class by Henry Peepgrass, but in later life became a really good oyster sloop, making money for our owners. And the Lizzie D. Bell was originally a sloop that won a lot of races. They used to race the oyster sloops even against prominent yachts, and they did very well. Lizzie D. Bell at one time won every race that it had entered in a regatta. And, but later on, they would drop the rig and add a steam engine to make it more functional. And this was common right up until the early 1910s. Here's a typical oyster. And as it says here, all things considered, the oyster provided a good living for many early City Island residents and is greatly responsible for the island's growth and development. Now, the first City Island Bridge, built in 1873, there was a committee of City Island businessmen, of which the Hortons, Ben Hedgeman, David Carl, and a few others, Captain Levinus, were all part of. And the bridge was built, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see the 197-foot battleship, the North Carolina. And David Carl had bought that at auction in October of 1867, taken to his yard, and he stripped it of all good wood and copper. They said there were copper rivets in there the size of a leg. And he was able to use all the wood, which turned out to be really good wood, in future schooners built at his yard. And many of the abutments in the first City Island Bridge were built using that wood from that. And to this day, the bridge was still up after the new City Island Bridge, now the old City Island Bridge, was built in 1901. And at a very low tide, if you're in the right or wrong spot, you can hit it with a boat if it has deep enough draft. But the committee owned the bridge for a short time, and then it became part of the town of Pelham. And here is the new bridge. And in fact, if you look underneath the bridge, you can see the old bridge in the distance. And the bridge would lead right into where Bridge Street is, right in front of the Lobster House restaurant and City Island yacht sales. And then, of course, at the bottom, you have the former City Island Bridge. That was in recent years. And then the new bridge with the intermediate or temporary bridge in the distance underneath it. The new bridge built on the footprint of the old bridge. Now, this is City Island in 1930. And there are several ways you can tell. Now, I got this photo out of an early 30s yachting magazine. But there are certain ways you can tell the age of a photo. And from this, I can see that Pelham Bay is still there as the fleet of the Stuyvesant Yacht Club in the upper right-hand corner shows. And you can see to the extreme right, Hunter Island and Twin Island right next to it. And then Tent City, you know, on the mainland, right by what was Orchard Beach at that time. South on Rodman Neck, you have the Metropolitan Yacht Club that had their fleet outside of Turtle Cove. And then City Island, the way I can really tell the date is that Pelham Bay is still there, and the dock in the middle of the picture on the east side of the island was the Nevins dock that was built in 1930, the long extension elevator dock. Also, if you see the three masts in the Jacob Basin, lower right, they belong to the big schooner Black Douglas, which was built for the Roebling family at Bath, Maine, but lived a good part of its life at City Island and at the Jacob Basin. This picture surfaced about 10, 15 years ago, and it was done by an artist, Rondell. And in viewing it, I immediately saw that it's probably the first image of a yacht yard or the marina industry on City Island that has been found. It's the first railway built by, it was built by a Mr. Underhill on the property of the estate of George W. Horton, under the direction of George W. Horton Jr. And it was just south of the property line where Pilot Street is now, basically where the middle travel lift is in the yard. But he had it done for the short hauling of boats. And what you see on there right now is an oyster sloop that's been hauled out. But you see the circle there with a capstan in the middle and a couple of horses. The raising of boats, the hauling out of the water, was done by the horses, oxen, or even men walking around in the circle with the bar from the capstan to raise the boat. And this was the first indication of shipbuilding on City Island. Now, City Island probably had boats built as early as it was inhabited. And they used to launch boats by means of grease skids if they were close enough to the beach, and they would use a cart with wheels to take them from a backyard barn or somewhere inland on the island, which was known to happen. And Levinas had a boat shop somewhere down by Tia Street also, that they could get them down. And I know Fred Glazier had built them into his barns. But this was the first marine railway that the island had. Now there's only one or two railways left on the island, the Harlem Yacht Club being the only one that uses it out of the clubs. Piloting is another, like the oyster industry, was another major industry on the island, in that you had a number of pilots that would guide the ships down the East River and through Hellgate. Hellgate could be treacherous at the time because of the rocks, the depth of water, and how it would rush through there. They say through Hellgate, you have at any given time more than twice the flow of Niagara Falls going through the Hellgate. And it was tough and it remains tough now that they've blasted the rocks away even. It remains a tough and difficult place to navigate at different times. Going down the East River can be like going down the rapids at times. But this is what was an everyday occurrence. And you would see ships like these that were later replaced by freighters and that. And it's ironic that the three pictures on the left and top right were from the 1800s, and the lower right is from the 1940s of City Island. But that's how it was, and piloting was very important and remains important, albeit they've moved the pilots off City Island to over to Fort Totten. And they're not called as much, but they still on occasion are, even for big yachts. This is Hellgate, and this was the whole, tells the whole story. If you look at the view of Hellgate between the Bronx, Queens, and Manhattan and Randall Island, you can see how the Harlem River and the East River bends there. And you can see where it would be difficult under most conditions to try it. But the currents and with the vessels that they had, it was very difficult, even with a pilot. But, and this is another view of the ships. As I said, that if you were international, you would come and ride at anchor off City Island and await a pilot, or in this case, they waited for quarantine doctors. And there was quite often that, if you remember Ed Sadler, he would row the doctors out to meet the schooners, and they would give them either the okay or the no-go for traveling any further, depending on if they had to be quarantined. But that picture was actually, which was always one of my favorite, and I thought was taken on a nice moonlit night, was actually high noon with a filter taken by Morris Rosenfeld. In this one, you see some of the early City Island shipyards, including the David Carl shipyard on the left, with the launching of the 146-foot Ambassadress for William Astor of the Astor Hotel. It was the largest schooner yacht in the country until after 1900, when it became a West Indies packet. But it was 146 feet from the perpendiculars and 235 feet from the end of the main boom to the tip of the bowsprit. The other yards in the photo are the Hawkins Yard, Peepgrass Yard, and the Biles Yard. Now this is the Magic, which was built in Philadelphia as a sloop and had been altered and rebuilt several times during its lifetime. It was built in 1857, but by 1869, it found its way to the Carl Yard, where it was converted to a schooner, a centerboard schooner, with increased draft, made longer and wider, and different schooner rig. They compared it, or they said in several articles, that it was like building a barrel using only the bunghole as a model. But she went on to sail in the 1870 defense of the America's Cup with a fleet of the best in the New York Yacht Club against the challenger, the Cambria, and became the first successful defender of the America's Cup in 1870. Now, I say that because before the race, she was a contender, but because she won it, she became the defender. From this race forward, they were only one-on-one rather than one on the whole fleet of the club boats. Now, the America, when she originally took the trophy home to America, raced against the best boats in the Royal Yacht Squadron. So it was kind of like, this is an answer to that. Now here we have the Ambassadress under sail. Again, she was the largest American schooner yacht and largest schooner yacht in the world at the time at 146 feet. But she looks kind of impressive. In fact, the tender being towed behind looks pretty impressive itself. But David Carl built a number of these type schooners and was well noted for them. In fact, the tenders hanging on the davits were probably built next door at the B.F. Wood Yard, which was on Marine Street, Franklin Avenue at the time. But they were well known as small boat builders, oyster boat builders, and they also had a very good self-righting lifeboat that they built. David Carl was also known for building three-masted schooners. Now, if you ever travel on the Jersey Turnpike or 95 in Connecticut, you probably follow a lot of the big 18-wheelers. And this is what they looked like back in the 1800s and early 1900s. These boats were typically built up to 200 feet and could carry an awful lot. And David Carl built shallow centerboard schooners so that they could navigate in shallow and tighter areas than the deep draft schooners. And because of their size and their rig, they could be handled by a crew of 7, captain, mate, cook, and crew. There's a William H. Bailey, another schooner built by Carl, and the David Carl, one of the early, one of several Hellgate. Actually, this was a Sandy Hook pilot boat built by David Carl in 1885, one of the last boats built under his ownership of the yard. And then the Constellation, Henry Peepgrass bought the David Carl yard in 1886. And after a couple of years had this yacht built, the 134-foot steel schooner yacht. And while Ambassador was the largest wood schooner yacht built in the country, Constellation was the largest steel schooner yacht built in the country. But she was acknowledged as maybe America's most beautiful yacht also. This was a black and white photo that was recently colorized by Frank Helston of Scandinavia. Then two early boats built by Henry Papegrass, where Consolidated is, the Titania in 1887 and Katrina 1888. Titania was built for C. Oliver Island, who had a home on Premium Point, and Katrina was built for the Auchincloss brothers, descendants of, well, who Jackie Onassis is a descendant of Newport, Rhode Island. Several other boats, typical of the boats built in the late 1800s by island shipyards, including the Brenton Reef LV-39, which was a light ship off of Brenton Reef, Rhode Island. Some sailing yachts, some famous ones, Nameless, Pixie, Seiss, Kestrel, and Pawnee. And on the top right, the Faisine, the fastest boat in the world at 31.6 miles an hour, built by B.F. Wood in 1893. Now, this is a picture by Warren Shippard. It was painted right at the turn of the century, 1900, of the island at late afternoon or sunset. And you're looking from about Center Street towards Fordham Street. You can see the Biles Yard on the extreme left, and the boat hauled out in the middle would be the Columbia, the America's Cup contender and defender in 1899 and 1900. One of only 3 boats to defend twice. And of course, you have a couple of commercial schooners offshore, as was typical then. Here's the island in 1930. And again, you see some of the big 3-masted schooners off the tip of the island. At this time, those schooners were probably schooner yachts, though, and they could have either been Guinevere, Dauntless, Migrant would be very soon after, and the Atlantic was also down that way. But in the foreground, you have a lot of the small boats on the northwest side, and the big yachts were on the southeast side. These are the yacht yards that were cluttered around City Island, around the whole perimeter. And they weren't just yacht yards, they were first-class, world-class yacht yards that was side by side, building some of the, not always the biggest, but always the finest design and construction methods used on. There's several of them. Robert Jacob building shed, where Pilot Cove, that would be on the same footprint now as Pilot Cove. And that's launching the Saramar for Lawrence Fisher of Fisher Brothers of General Motors. Now that building, the Robert Jacob building shed, was formerly a movie studio that was up in Mamaroneck on Edgewater Park, where D.W. Griffith had an estate and a studio for a number of years. But when it was finally closed, when D.W. Griffith finally decided to go out to Hollywood, he closed it and sold everything. And Robert Jacob decided to build the building. He had it dismantled, taken down to City Island by barge, and rebuilt here on the island. Ironically, the D.W. Griffith estate and movie studio was bought by bought from Henry Flagler, or his estate. Henry Flagler, the train baron, who also Flagler Beach in Florida is named after, had bought the property himself in the 1880s, early 1890s, from Leonard Jacob, Robert Jacob's father. So it comes full circle. But on the right, several of those boats are still around, in fact. But this is a picture of the largest yacht built by Nevins, the 120-foot Analgra. and it was a very famous boat for a while. The owner was the president of Irving Trust, who was also the president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. And the boat fell into different hands. It was General MacArthur's boat for use when he worked for Rand, the Rand Company in the early 50s or late 40s. And it was used on several movie sets also, including Some Like It Hot, Tequila Sunrise, and even in a Batman series when it was called The Lovely Lady. It was being restored about 15 years ago down in Florida, at which time vandals got on board, opened all the seacocks, and it sank. And the Coast Guard said that it had to be blown up because it was a navigational hazard. Here you had a couple of boats, Brilliant, which was probably the most impressive or the best built yacht of the 20th century, and Dorade, maybe the most influential sailing yacht of the 20th century. Dorade won the Transpac in 1936 and again in 1913. Overall, not just in a classic sense, but over all the new fancy yachts. Designed by Sparkman and Stevens, right on City Island, and right in the where Ray's Cafe is, which used to be the Sparkman and Stevens office. Now, like the old days, this is a scene that was repeated quite often. This is right off Consolidated in July of 1986 during the celebration of the reopening and centennial of Statue of Liberty. You have the Shenandoah and a couple of other yachts right off the yard. These are some of the power boats built on City Island and some of the sail yachts. Now, we have albums on all the yards and sailmakers on City Island, which can be found in albums on the museum's Facebook page, which gives in-depth histories and more explanations on them. But can you go back a little bit on this? This, okay, all right. Yeah, most people associate City Island with the America's Cup, and rightly so. In the time that the America's Cup has been, we had the Magic that was completely rebuilt and won the first defense, and then the Freedom in the lower right-hand corner here, which was the last boat to win before the Americans finally lost to the Australians in 1983 to Liberty. Liberty was the loser. So the long string of victories was bookended by City Island built yachts. Here you have Columbia, Constellation, Intrepid, Courageous, and Freedom. You had 7 that were built, Independence and also Independence and Enterprise, that were contenders but not defenders. But here you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that won 7 different campaigns over the years. Columbia and Courageous were the only 2 12s to defend twice, and along with Columbia of the early time, were the only 2-time defenders of the America's Cup. These are the albums that I was referring to. This is only a portion. This is only 9 of the over 70 albums that there are on sail-offs, shipyards, and yachts on City Island. And as I say, it will be growing more. We're going to have the timeline put on this also, so you can take your time and go through looking at them at any given time. One of the things that we didn't mention is that the restaurants always took a second seat to the shipyards, sail-offs, oystering, and Hellgate pilots, but they were always a major industry up here, and City Island was always known for its seafood and that. And here you can get really good seafood with generous portions at any one of the many restaurants. And one thing that most recent islanders have noted is the traffic in the summer. The traffic may be bad, but it actually is better than it has been in my lifetime. The driving might have gotten worse, but the actually with the way the traffic patterns work, it's actually better than it's ever been. And it was bad right from the time they rebuilt Orchard Beach, and it was something that they couldn't foresee. But enjoy it, because traffic is as good as it's ever going to be. But these are just some of the restaurants. This is the island, even though this picture was taken during the 1950s and was featured actually in a National Geographic, pretty much is the way that many people would envision it. You can see that Pilot or Pickwick Terrace on the end of Pilot Street is not yet on the property on the left-hand side. The landfill isn't in at the tip of the island at Belden Point, and the Mars Yacht Club is still there. So this is a picture that's easily 65 years old. More recent, you can see City Island and Hart Island, how it fits in with Rodman Neck. And what's amazing with this is if you take a look at some of the old maps that we had, how these fellas could really chart out an island without having all the equipment that they have today to do that. But they were pretty exact in getting the right parameters for the size and shape of the island. And this is something that will always remain classics at City Island, is that the City Island sunset rivals anywhere in the world. We're in a good spot for it with East Chester Bay. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dad, for bearing with me as I went through your slides, trying to hurry you up, as I know you had so much information, but also trying to make room for some questions. That was great. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions from the audience, and if you have any more, let us know. So one easy one to start off with is just if you have any photos or an album with the arcade at Belden Point that Joanne could look for.
There are several pictures of the arcade. You know who took good pictures back in that era was Henry Devereaux and Alice Payne. Alice Payne wrote the Tales of the Clam Digger book, but she had some photos, and a number of them haven't been scanned yet. But if anyone's looking for earlier pictures of that building, they can just look at the one of the horse and carriages, because there were a number of pictures of the horse and carriage on the trolley taken right at that spot, just below Rochelle Street on City Island Avenue. That later became, or earlier than the Penny Arcade, was Peggy's Gardens and several other different names. But during the winter in the late 40s, there were actually 4 or 5 Looters 16s built in there by members of the Morris Yacht Club.
And there are a few questions on the impact of different industries on the economy. So one on clamming and how it affected the economy of City Island after it left, and then Nevins Shipyard specifically, the impact of that.
Well, by the time that the yards closed or began closing, the younger generations were going to work in city jobs. The traffic, one of the things that slowed down the yacht yards from becoming large shipyards was because they didn't have the transportation that a lot of the yards had down in the city. In other words, you weren't going to get guys from Brooklyn and that coming up here. Ironically, a couple of guys that worked in the boat yards lived as far out as Southampton on the island and came in every day.
So
but
public transit, like a ferry or something, might have helped.
It could have. It could have, definitely. And they talked about it. But remember, there's always two sides to a story. And the one side is where the ferry is taken off from, and the other is to where it's going to. And a lot of the towns on the North Shore of Long Island didn't want a ferry running out of their area. But they definitely worked. And in fact, we have photos of some of the steamships that would come in and dock at Belden Point at the dock there that had regular stops on Long Island Sound. So we did have a certain amount of ferry service, and it was a popular thing back then.
All right. Going back to Orchard Beach and Robert Moses, or I guess the tent city that was there. Can you just discuss that a little bit more, and the structures that were there, and if there were any were moved to City Island?
Well, there were a number of places before it was Tent City. There was a naval station in Pelham Bay, or Rodman Neck rather, of which a number of famous people, Humphrey Bogart was in the Navy there, Edward G. Robinson. But it was a big place, and there were houses all over. In fact, one of the big houses that they had, I'm not sure what they used it for, but when they were starting to remap the roads, the road actually went through the building, the building was about where the circle is now. But you had the Metropolitan Yacht Club, you had the Morris Yacht Club, you had the Stuyvesant Yacht Club at different points around Rodman Neck, including the Marshall Mansion. And they were all taken down and razed. And some of the bungalows or structures that were in Tent City, which started out as tents, and then they would add on, and before you knew it, after a couple of years, a tent became a wood structure on the property there. And some of them were moved to City Island. Now, Jordan's Boathouse, which was just over the bridge on the right-hand side, just north of the bridge, was one of them in particular. And that became a house on City Island on Hawkins Street, 153 Hawkins Street. And I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I was talking to a descendant, and he called up to the museum about Jordan's Boathouse, and he asked, he said, "You probably wouldn't remember Jordan's Boathouse." And that I said, "Well, what if I told you I was in Jordan's Boathouse about an hour ago?" And so I explained to him what had happened. But there were a number of homes like that were taken over. Some are not as evident as others, and some people think were taken from there and weren't. There were a lot of Sears homes too.
All right, we're going to go to two more questions because we're running up on 8:45 now. So one is just, can you talk about any of the best books on the history of City Island for anyone looking to go?
There are 3 books: the Alan Flood book, the Catherine Scott book, and the Alice Payne book. And they all deal on City Island, and they all complement each other. It's not repetitious. The Alan Flood book is a good history book on the island. It gives a good description. It's got a lot of early pictures. The Catherine Scott book is a photo history of different photos, including a lot of the people that have collected. And the Alice Payne book has a lot of the old traditions and stories about, tales of the clam digger. And they all, yes, that's exactly. And they were all dedicated, historians on the place.
And if anyone wants a copy of the Alan Flood book, the museum has a bunch of them. So email us and let us know. We'd be happy to connect you with one of them. All right, final question is about the boat building industry. Can you talk about when it disappeared, and do you know why it disappeared?
Well, the boat building, it came upon because the necessity of it, and it was all custom boat building, but it began to fade in the late 50s or change with the introduction of fiberglass. with fiberglass, you could come up with a very successful design and build a model of a boat. And you didn't have to have custom boats built anymore. You knew you had something with that, and it made it much easier to build the boats also. City Island was never known as a production boat building place, albeit the Sea Lions were as close to that as they got, where they built a number of the Sea Lion runabouts of different models. And they were selling them by the hundreds during the late 20s and early 30s. But Miniford was the last boat building place on the island. Before that was Kretz's and Miniford. Nevins closed down in 1962. The last boat that they built was 1959. Wilder, a big Alden design motor sailor.
Would you say that a lot of them closed down after the war?
Without question, because the price of having a boat built over in Europe was much cheaper, or even up in Maine. Lot that had to do with yacht yards are a crazy thing. They take in a lot of money, but they also need a lot of money to just exist.
Yeah.
That's why the yards that are around the island that people think, oh, these guys are making a fortune. Well, they can make a lot of money, but at the same time, once you stop feeding the monster, they can die very quickly. And what happens was that they became overtaxed. And in yacht yards, you have a lot less cash flow than you do in other businesses, where you might get a lot at a certain time, but then you it's like pulling teeth to get other money.
Yacht owners to pay their bills. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Dad. And thank you everyone for coming. It's so nice to see so many names and so many people that I know because of my dad here. So thank you all for joining and for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. This video will be uploaded to YouTube. We'll be sending out an email for the next winter webinar, which is the history of PS17. So we're going to have on about 5 panelists, students, and teachers from PS17 to sort of talk, and we hope that all former students from PS17 will come and join us. And then the final winter webinar is my dad talking with Dick Sadler on the America's Cup, which is still going on right now, although America is no longer in the competition. Everyone should join us. Follow us on social media, and thank you so much for joining tonight. And thank you, Dad.
My pleasure.